I worked it out the other day and I've been riding motorbikes now for 37 years. And over that time I've owned something like 23 different bikes. Everything from budget rat bikes to top-end tourers. And I don't remember ever being dissatisfied with the suspension on a new bike. Now I remember that one of the things that finally persuaded me to make the move from BMW across to the Triumph T120 was the reports by the motorcycle press that Triumph had finally sorted out the suspension on the T120 and it was what it should be. And initially, after taking delivery of the bike, the suspension seemed okay. It's only as you get used to the bike and start to push it and explore its limits that you realise just how limited the stock suspension is on the T120. I'm very much in agreement with a lot of other reports out there that the bike is undersprung and underdamped. Now I dare say that if you only weigh 10 stone wet through, you never take a pillion, you never carry any luggage, and you ride on perfect roads in quite a sedate manner, you're going to be more than happy with the stock suspension. But if you don't fit in that pigeonhole, it soon becomes apparent that some changes are probably worthwhile. And I would say that without a doubt, the emails that I receive, the messages I get on Facebook and the comments I get here on YouTube certainly bear out that the main complaint with the T120 is the suspension. Now I replaced the race shocks with those wonderful Hagen Nitros back in May, I think it was. And there's absolutely no doubt about it, they transformed the way that the bike handled and the levels of comfort. But there was nothing that these shocks could do to alter the way the front end of the bike reacted. And in many ways all they really did was highlight the inadequacies of those front forks. The soft springs in those forks means that you have very limited feedback from the front wheel on what it's doing on the road. Dive when you're braking hard can be excessive, and that combination of soft springing and soft dampening means that you end up tensing up at every pothole that you can't avoid, getting ready for that banging and crashing to be transmitted through your arms to your shoulders as the suspension bottoms out, sending shockwaves through your body. And for me, I found that these front forks have been the biggest source of rider fatigue that I experienced with this bike. And then there's another little problem, an oddity if you like, something that I've never experienced on any other bike. It's an odd sensation and the bike literally has only done it 4 or 5 times. In fact, I remember the first time it happened, I actually stopped the bike and got off because I thought something had come loose on the front end. And that is that under hard braking, especially if you hit some imperfection or bump in the road as you're braking, you often feel a slight twisting motion transmitted through the forks to the handlebars. Now, we've all experienced fork flex, and this was more than just fork flex. Don't get me wrong, it's not dangerous. It's just downright odd. And it's something that I've learned to live with, although I could never put my finger on what was actually causing it. Now there are many well-known manufacturers out there currently offering front fork spring upgrades for the T120 and for the other bikes in the Bonneville range. And it's hard to decide which is going to be the right option for you. Now you can pay well over £100 for one of these kits, and some are more difficult to fit than others, depending on whether or not a different grade of fork oil is required. Now eventually I decided on the Tech Bike spring upgrade for 2 main reasons. One was price, because it's only £60, and 2, it doesn't require a lighter fork oil. Now this only sounds like a small thing, but the problem with the T120 is it doesn't have drain plugs in the fork legs. So to change that oil is a major job. It's a full front end off job to remove both forks so they can tip them upside down to get the existing oil out, and I didn't want to go down that road. Now the first odd thing that I realised when I got these springs was that they are actually about 3 inches longer than the stock springs, and it wasn't entirely clear to me why that should be the case. And the kit also contains 2 shortened spacers that account for that extra spring length and replace the existing spacers that come with the bike. Now you need to have the bike on its centre stand to carry out this upgrade, and you also need to get the front wheel up off the ground so that the front forks are fully extended and it takes all the pressure off those springs. Now you can do this by means of an appropriate jack, or if you're having to use the low-tech method that I was forced to use, then a few appropriately placed blocks of wood with some spacers just to get that front end up off the ground. You're going to need a slim open-ended 14mm spanner, a 30mm socket with a small extension bar and an appropriate ratchet, and the correct size Allen key just to loosen off your handlebar clamps so that you can tip them back and get the cables out of the way of your fork caps. Now the fork caps are made from aluminium and they're quite soft, so you might want to put a thin piece of cloth between your fork cap and your socket to stop it from getting marked. I'd also recommend putting a thick towel or something over your tank just to prevent any mishaps. Now when you first get your fork cap off, the first thing you'll come across is a steel spacer which should be removed. After that there's a shim, which is a posh word for a washer, and you should remove that as well. Now you can reach these with your fingers, and you can also just reach the third plastic spacer with your fingers as well. After that you're going to need some sort of tool. Now you can use one of these magnets on the end of the stick if you've got one. I couldn't find mine, so I had to use the special fork maintenance tool CH01. Now these generally come in kit form. You can find them in your wife or your girlfriend's wardrobe, or if you live in America, closet. They're made of plastic, although the older wire versions do work just as well. And the part that you want from this kit is the long part that goes across the bottom. Clip it off at both ends so that it leaves you with some sort of hook, so that you can hook it underneath your shims and your spring to remove them. Also, they often have an additional little hook underneath. Just snip the end of this off, because you'll need that little stub sticking out later on when we get onto the right hand fork. When you've removed the part of the kit that you want, return the other part of it to your wife's or girlfriend's wardrobe or closet. Replace the garment that it had on it before. It's likely that it could be several months or even years before she notices that it has been altered, by which time you will have forgotten all about it and you have the facility of plausible deniability. When your tool's ready, use it to remove the second shim and then finally the stock spring from the fork leg. Now before you remove the spring completely, just take a little bit of time to get as many of the drips of oil off that spring back into your fork leg as you possibly can, just to minimise oil loss. You are going to lose a few drops anyway, but it's not going to be enough to make any difference. Once you've got the spring out, it's time to put your new kit back in, and it's the exact reverse of what you've just done, except you're replacing the spring with the upgraded spring, and also you're replacing the stock spacer with the shorter spacer. And remember, your upgraded spring is a progressive spring, so it needs to go in with the tighter windings to the top. So the sequence should be your new spring, one shim, your replacement spacer, your second shim, and then finally the steel stock spacer. When you replace your fork cap, you will find that there is just a little bit of pressure there compared to the old spring. It's not much. Just carefully feel your way in. Remember, this cap is made from aluminium, so it's soft and it is a very fine thread. Make sure that it seats properly. If you have trouble screwing it in, it could mean that you've cross-threaded it. Make sure that doesn't happen. Screw it in as far as you can by hand, and then using your 30mm socket and a cloth, tighten it back up. Right, so that's your left fork leg done. It's time to move over to the right fork leg, and this is substantially different. Now when you unscrew this cap, you'll find you can't actually withdraw it. That's because the cap is connected to the damping rod to the damping cartridge. Now, I've stripped a few forks down in my time and I've never come across anything like this. So I had to break the habit of a lifetime and read the instructions. Luckily, I'd kept them in a safe place just in case. With damping cartridges, it's customary to fit one in each leg, whereas Triumph have chosen here, I'm presuming as a cost-saving exercise, just to fit one to the right leg. There's no cartridge in the left leg. Now, this doesn't really make sense. In fact, I've seen Morris dancing that makes more sense than this. And I think this is a pretty good indication as to why the front suspension doesn't work as well as you would expect it to on a premium bike. And I would wager that this is what is responsible for that odd twisting sensation I sometimes get under hard braking, because this right fork leg is responsible for damping both forks. So effectively you've got an imbalance. Now, to get your fork cap off so that you can progress, you're going to need a slim open-ended 14mm spanner and insert it between the fork cap and the top of the forks and lock it in place into that 14mm locking nut. You then have to unscrew the cap using your socket from the damping rod. Once this is done, you're ready to get on with the installation. Now, when you let go of this damping rod, it is going to fall down inside the fork leg, but it only drops down about 8 or 9 inches and it's easily retrievable with that special tool CH01, so don't panic. You can get special damping rod holders, especially for this job, to keep the damping rod up, but to be honest, unless you're doing this job once a week, I don't think they're worth the expense. Now, the first thing to do is remove the plastic spacer. You can reach this with your fingers, you don't need any tools. There is no metal spacer on this side. Once you've removed that plastic spacer, you need to use your special tool to remove the shim and then the spring. And again, there is only one shim on this right hand leg. Once the shim's out, using the same method as before, remove your spring and get as much oil off it as you possibly can before withdrawing it completely. Now, this side is a little bit more fiddly because you've got that damping rod in the way, but it's easily doable. Once you've got your spring out, it's the same process with your new kit as before. Put your new spring in with the tighter coils to the top. Do the same with your shim, making sure that it's seated properly in the bottom. Using that little stub on the inside of your special tool, retrieve your damping rod before trying to insert your final spacer. What you'll need to do is momentarily let go of your damping rod as you drop the spacer in. Don't worry, because the damping rod does drop quite slowly, whereas the spacer will drop down quickly. This should give you time to let the spacer drop and then quickly grab your damping rod before it disappears again. It's then just a little bit of a fiddle getting your fork cap threaded back onto that damper rod, and once you've done that, the damper rod can no longer fall down inside. Again, using your 14mm spanner, screw the fork cap fully back onto the damper rod and then tighten it up before replacing your fork cap. Your forks have now been upgraded, and wow, what a difference this kit makes. Tech Bike Parts have managed to substantially offset this imbalance caused by the damping cartridge only being in one leg by lengthening the springs. Also, the coils on these springs are spaced further apart than they are on the originals. This means that these springs are stiffer, which makes them harder to compress. This takes some of the stress off that damping cartridge, so it does feel much more balanced. I tried really hard to get the bike to do that twisty thing again with the handlebars under hard braking, and so far I've not managed to do it. Now, Tech were obviously mindful of the fact that a stiffer spring could make the front suspension more uncomfortable, so they've added that extra 3 inches of tighter coiling, which is softer, to aid comfort. And into the bargain, this effectively gives you a little bit more spring travel than you had with the original springs. And the overall effect is a complete transformation of the front end of your bike while you're riding. The front end immediately feels tauter as soon as you sit on it, and although the sag does seem to have been reduced slightly, it doesn't seem to affect the steering. Those harder springs give you a much better feel through the handlebars of what that front tyre is doing on the road. It seems now to have lost all that vagueness that it had before. The ride feels firmer, but comfort hasn't suffered. Those top 3 inches of the tighter, softer coils take up the initial slack of any bump or imperfection on the road that you hit, reducing the inertia before the main stiff part of the spring takes over. It absorbs minor defects in the road to the point where you can barely notice them, and it cushions the rider from hard hits without bottoming out. I dare say that if you hit a big enough pothole fast enough, it will eventually bottom out, but the incidents of that happening are going to be substantially reduced, and I mean substantially. And finally, I would say that dive under hard braking has been reduced by 20 or 30%, maybe even more. The overall effect then is that the bike now feels like a premium bike, as it should have done when it left the factory. I can't vouch for all the other kits that are out there, whether they're better or whether they're worse than this Tech Bike kit, but what I will say is this. If you have £60 to spend and you only have that money to carry out one modification on your bike, this is possibly the most worthwhile performance modification you could possibly make to a T120. Now, this video does seem to have overrun, as they often do. I hope I haven't missed anything out, but if anybody's got any questions, please just get in touch with me through the comments section on this video. And I will leave a product link in the video description for this spring kit. Just to let you know, Lomo Watersports have been back in touch with me again this week. They actually received the leg bags a little bit earlier than expected, and they are now on sale if you've been waiting for them. I hope you found this video useful and interesting. Thanks for watching. Please leave a like and subscribe. I'll be back next week as usual, and I'll see you then.